This talk actually is birthed out of some feedback that we received from our first library talk on considering PhD programs and what to look for when you do that. Some of the feedback was we didn't have a woman's perspective. And I feel like that's a valid critique of our first talk, because women have a different experience, educational experience, at institutions across this country. And so, and they have a different educational experience and academic experience in different academic institutions across this country. And so we felt like we needed to have this talk to give advice to women who are currently pursuing degrees, whether it's at the collegiate level, master's level, or PhD level, and to give them advice on what it's like to be a woman in academics. So let me introduce our speakers. On the far end here we have Dr. Adrianne Miles. She is professor of English and linguistics here at Southeastern. She earned a BA and an MA in English from North Carolina State University. She has a PhD in linguistics from the University of Texas at Austin as well. In the middle we have Dr. Amanda Aucoin. She is professor of history here. She has a BA from Ouachita Baptist University in history and political science, and an MA and a PhD from the University of Arkansas in history. And then finally we have Dr. Keith Harper, who is a professor of Baptist studies here. He had a BA in theology from Lexington Baptist College, an MA in U.S. history from Murray State University, and a PhD in U.S. history from the University of Kentucky. And I feel like I have to justify a little bit why I have a man here on a talk on women in scholarship. And part of the reason that I guess the biggest reason that Dr. Harper is here is that he's continuously been over the years an encouragement to women who have pursued academic careers at this school. And as someone who wants to be a future professor, he's a model for me as a man and how I can encourage women in their academic pursuits. So that's why I have him here. All right, so first question, and any of you can jump in at any time to answer this. But what are some of the questions that women should be asking when looking at institutions to further their education, especially if as women? What type of things should they look for?
Well, I was thinking about this, and I kind of think of it in a couple of different ways, actually. So my education is completely secular. So as I approached that question myself, on the other side of those degrees, especially for graduate school, I was looking for programs that were doing what I was interested in. I was looking for professors that I wanted to work with, that were doing work that really appealed to me. That's what I want to do, or that's really close to what I want to do. I want to work with that professor. So that, looking at that is very important. But since I've been here and been a part of other conversations, I would also add to that. So not just finding the professor or the few professors that are doing the work that you're really interested in, that you want to do, but finding out how those professors work with women. Do they work with women? Have they worked with women? Those sorts of questions.
Yeah, I think those are good points. A couple, maybe one or two things I would add. I would point out that my background was secular as well. Thank you. My background was secular as well. So I teach at a seminary, but I've never attended a seminary. We went to a state university. And when I went to graduate school, I worked a year out of college, then went to graduate school, met my husband there. So I went to graduate school as a single woman, not planning not to get married, but I didn't have plans to get married at the time either. And I just didn't really consider that I had questions I needed to ask as a female at that time. I was 22 or 23 and just sort of eye on the prize. Now coming here, though, at this time, having 4 children, something I might say in hindsight, just to add to what Andrea said, is you might want to consider how they work with women on an individual level and then also on a programmatic level. And this, I guess, would go for men and women, but how long is the program? What are the residency requirements? How much time would you have to finish? My first son was born. I was what we call ABD, which most of you know, I'm sure, is all but dissertation. And I remember my advisor just did not look thrilled when I told him we were expecting our first child, because I think he thought, well, there goes that dissertation, right? But I did finish that year. And so I don't know how many allowances the program would have been willing to make, and it's different when you're the woman, when you're a mom, right? It's a little bit different. You're the one who's with that child, expecting the child the first year of their life. So I would just say that makes a big difference. You want to consider what the requirements are, how much leeway is given, and how much time do you have to finish, maybe even ABD. So family considerations are big for men and women, but in hindsight, that might be a question I would ask that I didn't ask.
Well, let's make that 3 votes for a secular background, because graduate school for me was a secular experience. But I think there are issues whenever you're looking for a graduate program. I think there are issues that basically transcend gender, and my colleagues have touched on those in very close detail. You need a program that your advisor is going to be accessible. Lots to consider. Common wisdom in a secular context is you follow the money. Whoever gives you the best deal, that's where you go. That's terrible advice. You can get a very good fellowship from an institution where nobody is interested in what you're doing. So you do need professors that are going to resonate with what you're interested in, but those professors aren't going to do you a lot of good if they're not available to work with. I had a colleague at the University of Kentucky with a freshly minted PhD from Penn. So we're at lunch one day, and I asked her what her experience was like at Penn, and she said it was an unholy nightmare because people were scrambling for classes. She said, I have a degree in American history. I was taking U.S. Lit. I was doing this, that, and the other thing, and consequently, nobody, quote, nobody wanted to mess with graduate students. So if you're looking for a program, look for somebody that's interested in what you're interested in and see if they're going to be accessible to you. And if they're going to be accessible, there are different levels of access. They can be jolly good colleagues, they can be jolly good people, they can be fun-loving men, fun-loving women, but if they're not going to give you good feedback on what you turn in, you need someone who's going to walk you through a program that if you write something good, they're going to tell you. If you write something horrible, they need to set you down and go, look, you're messing up. Don't do this, do this. This is good, this is better. This is the path, walk you in it. That's the kind of leadership that you need, and those folks are not always real easy to find. Now, I was fortunate. I stumbled into it. I was like Professor Aucoin. I didn't know what to ask, and God in His providence was good to me, and He set me up with some really good people at the University of Kentucky, and I was fortunate. I learned a lot of really good lessons on the fly, and they were positive.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about balance of life then. Dr. Quinn, you mentioned that you were married during your graduate studies and had your first child while you were ABD. How did you balance all of that? And then maybe some of you can share, the two of you can share from your experience both at the level when you were getting your PhD or your education, and then at the academic level, because I know you've had children since then as well. So maybe discuss that.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you balance that? This is something we're all still learning on, right? Working on. The way that's worked for me, and I know it's going to be different for different people, one thing that's important as a Christian woman is what does your husband think about what you're doing? That's important. We have always had, my husband is Associate Dean of the College and a history professor as well, so we're both in academia. That has been for us a very friendly environment, family-friendly environment, I feel like, because of the flexibility that academia allows. There are definitely things I feel like that I've been able to do, or that he has been able to do with children, that if we had had a 9-to-5 year-round office job, it would have been much more difficult, especially in the younger years when you're sort of working early on. You don't really have much tenure or position yet. So flexibility in academia has been great for us, and so one of the things that helps both of us find balance is that we never schedule our classes at the same time. For example, so if there's some kind of parent emergency, one of us is almost always available, and that doesn't mean it's just the easiest thing. Sometimes we have other things we need to be doing, but there's someone available, so you don't have this terrible emergency on your hand. So that's one way. Also, I want to point out I've always worked part-time. I'm an adjunct professor, so I usually teach 1 or 2 classes a semester, one of those now online, and that's a whole nother topic. I think that opens up a world of opportunity for men and women, maybe women especially with children at home, is online teaching. So that's been very helpful. I would have a little bit harder time to speaking to, if one of you is in a regular sort of year-round job, 8 to 5 type job, how you would balance that might be a little more difficult, but you would want to think about that ahead of time.
So for me, when I started graduate school, I was single. The whole time I was working on my master's degree, I was single. I got married after my first semester working on my PhD, and our first son was born 10 days after I defended my dissertation. So that worked out. That was God's grace there. When I was single, and this was really true, both single and married, and I tell my students this from time to time, I am truly lazy at heart. I like downtime. I like to just, watch a movie. I love sitting on the couch. It is one of my favorite things to do. So even as a single person and as a married person, I definitely scheduled my work time. I learned kind of early on to treat graduate work like a job. And so I had certain hours in the day that I would work, and I would work hard. But I wouldn't work. I mean, maybe if I had a test to study for or something major, I would work a little bit later. Usually around 6 or 7, I would stop working, and I would have the rest of the evening free. On the weekends, I really tried to guard my weekends. As a single person, I wanted to just have that downtime, to let my brain relax and kind of just have some off time. Now, I would work a little bit on the weekends. As a married person, I really tried to protect Saturday and Sunday. Like, I might work till 7:30 on Friday night, but it would be so that I could have the rest of Friday night off. My husband and I could spend Saturday and Sunday together. So I really would treat it like a job, and that has helped. And my husband, he has his master's degree, so he was very understanding of what it takes to succeed in graduate school. He is a civil engineer, and he currently works for the town of Wake Forest. He has worked for consulting firms in the private sector, but now he works for the town. But thankfully, and by God's grace, his job is very flexible. It is, an 8 to 5 job. But unless he has a meeting or unless he has something going on, if we need him, if the boys needed him, if I were teaching a class and they're getting sick at school and somebody's got to go get the little boy who's sick, he can usually get away and do that. So there has been great flexibility in his job, which I'm very thankful for. And I started out teaching part-time, teaching 1 class a semester and then 2 and then 3. And so a year ago fall was my first semester as a full-time employee here. So that has been an adjustment, balancing full-time work. And my kids are older. I have a middle schooler and a high schooler. In many ways, that makes life easier because they can do a lot of things for themselves. They take their own baths, they get themselves to bed, they brush their own teeth, all that sort of thing. But they don't drive. And so as children get older, they're really involved in a lot of things. And so finding the time, okay, how are we going to get this one to this place and then get the other one to the other place? But I'm thankful that we live and both of us work really close to home and the schools are close by. So it's worked out, but it is a balancing act.
Dr. Harper?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how we balance that. I think Dr. Miles' advice is really good. If you can treat your program like a job, that's great. It was impossible for us. We would normally we'd put in a full day, and then nighttime was pretty much for my wife and my little boy. And when David went to bed, my wife was ready to go to sleep as well, and I would normally go to Andy and Robert's place, and we would work on history until the wee hours of the morning, and that was a pattern of life. My wife's sitting there nodding. Yes, she remembers those days. So, yeah, you put in your full day, you have some family time at night, and then we would talk about history until the wee hours of the morning. That kind of goes back to one of the programs that you're looking for. You learn an awful lot. You probably learn more from your own graduate school colleagues than you do your professors or basically your library time, just by working out your own thinking on particular issues along the way. And I think that's really important. You never know. That's always a bit of a gamble on any program that you go into because you can't know those people ahead of time. But balancing all I can say is my schedule was a lot more flexible than my wife's. So we tried to plan around her schedule because I could make mine fit. And I'm an insomniac anyway, so it really didn't matter. If it didn't fit, fine, she goes to bed and I go back to work. So that's kind of the way that it worked for us. You know, if you work around the clock, it's not a problem.
If you don't need sleep, there's no balancing problem, is what you're saying.
If you don't get sleep.
You don't get
That's
sleep.
right. Needing it's one thing,
Yeah,
getting it is
right.
something else, because once the kids come along, all bets are off.
Yeah, as far as sleep goes.
Yeah.
I would add one thing too that we were speaking of that reminded me of. I decided when I was a young mom, and our oldest son is now 15, and I was working on my dissertation his first year of life. I'd done all my research, so the traveling was done, and so that was great to just have all my material there. The internet played a role, but this was 15 years ago. The internet was not playing near as large of a role as it does now. There just wasn't near as much online, so I was glad that part was done. But I just remember thinking, I'm going to have some childcare. There's no way around. I mean, the idea you're going to write a dissertation during nap time is a joke. That's just not going to happen, right? You're not going to do hardly anything during nap time, actually. So I just think as a woman, you have to be open. Sometimes we have unrealistic expectations of ourselves that maybe men don't have of themselves, and that is that you will be able to do everything. We worked at a small Williams Baptist College, a small college, one of the Southern Baptist colleges at that time. They had a little child care center on campus for students and faculty. It was mainly students of children of students who would come there. And I determined that my son was going to have to go. He went 2 or sometimes 3 mornings a week so that I could work on my dissertation and finish it during that first year. So that to me was a decision that I remember walking him in the stroller one day thinking, this is just not going to work. Either I won't do the dissertation or I have to do some childcare, and that helped me balance. So I knew that when he was there, those 2 mornings a week, dishes in the sink, laundry's in the dryer, and you work on that project, whatever you're working on. So maybe that's some practical advice that would be helpful too. And that way, in other times, I didn't feel that always hanging over my head or feel stressed out that I wasn't getting some project done.
Do you guys want to add anything else or comment?
Yeah, it was so different for us because my wife and I had been married 10 years whenever I went to graduate school, and we were told by 3 experts we were not supposed to have children, so we thought, no big deal, do your thing, be done with it, and so forth. And then about halfway through the program, we're about to have a baby. One of us was about to have a baby. The baby I about had was metaphorical. What in the world is going on here? And so I remember the day that she came back. She's sitting right there, as a matter of fact, next to Heather, my wife. And I remember the day that we were standing in our kitchen at that time, and she had come back from the doctor, and he had confirmed, that she was going to have a baby. So when we stopped crying, I looked at her and I said, straight up, do we finish or do we stop right here? Because I need to go get a job. Your call. And I'll let you make that decision, because once I walk away from it, I'm not coming back. What do you think? She said, you've come too far to stop now. Hurry up. And so, so I was done. If I hadn't gotten bad advice, but I'm over it. I used to be so bitter about it. But I tell you what, I'm over it now. I got done in about 4.5 years. So, that was one reason I was at Andy and Roberts till the middle of the night, just because there was an urgency to get it done. But if you have children, or if you're planning on getting married and you might have children in the middle of the program, listen to what Dr. Aucoin says. We would have had an awful time if we did not have Miss Jerry Burke, a woman from church who watched David. I've always taken very early classes. I got to the University of Kentucky about 7:20, 7:30. I love 8 o'clock classes. Get them out of the way. Get yourself in the library and get yourself finished. And when I was done with that, I went to Miss Jerry's and I picked David up, and we were waiting for her whenever she got home. Godly woman, godly environment, safe environment. All of those things are really important for your kids. And that's a good word, Amanda. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback on that. I think that is exactly right. But the way Amanda said, let go of that Wonder Woman complex. It's ridiculous. It's not real. Nobody does that. Let it be okay to hire childcare. Let it be okay to have frozen pizza for dinner. You can live. I've done it on frozen pizza. Quick spaghetti. You can live with dirty clothes. everything doesn't have to be done. It's okay to adjust to a different standard of living for a little while.
Yeah. Yeah, if they want to get washed that bad, they'll walk to the machine. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so
Follow that.
yeah, thanks. No transition there.
God hates cowards.
So, anyways, what are some of the unique challenges and opportunities that being a woman I should not have tried to do this from memory. Let me go back to my list of questions. What are some of the unique challenges and opportunities for women in PhD work in academia?
I'll start with that one.
Okay.
Thanks in part to the American feminist movement, I think folks have never been more sensitive to gender equity than they are now. And naturally, you know, I'm not going to fall in line behind everything that Gloria Steinem does or says, or any other feminist for that matter, but I think they did call attention to the fact that there were segments of academia, if not all of academia, a generation ago that was little more than a boys' club or an old men's club, however you want to look at it. So in broaching the issues of sexism along the way, I think that they have diversified the workplace in many ways that are very healthy. Perspective, if all you have is a one-sided gender perspective, I think that that can pose certain challenges. So I think now, even though the job market is tough, and I've got this standard speech that I give anybody that says, you know, I think I want to do a PhD, I tell them think again, because the job market's hard, it's difficult, and what have you. If that's exactly what you want to do, there's a lot of hard work, you know, we can help you do that, but you just got to know you're swimming against the tide. One of our graduates is, he's ABD at Florida State right now with a very good advisor. He's got a very good dissertation topic. It will likely be published along the way whenever he's finished with it, but he's on the job market and he's having a very tough time of it. There are other avenues that you can apply your PhD in, and I would point out that if you have a PhD in some kind of theological studies, you can also pick up a degree in library science, and library work is a rewarding field. You can do editorial work. If you're a good writer, you can work for a lot of presses, either as a freelance editor or you can be hired on to do editorial work. That's pretty rewarding. And largely what I'm trying to say is what you do with your PhD largely depends on how you use it and how you market yourself.
What was the question exactly again, though? About in the PhD program itself, special challenges?
PhD and academia. What are some opportunities and challenges?
Okay. I never feel like if there was a lot of sexism, I didn't know about it at the secular university where I was. All my professors were male. Maybe there was one or two women at that time. There are quite a few more now. And there was a statistic I was thinking about in thinking about this panel, and I wish I'd looked it up, but I just didn't have a chance to do it. But if you consider the number of individuals who are getting degrees today, isn't it a majority of women? I know it is in the arts and sciences. In the humanities, it's a majority of women for undergraduate. And for things like PhDs in history, which I am in English, it's approaching a majority as well, is it not? I just notice in reading the literature a lot of times you talk about people who've gotten their PhDs that the department wants to announce, it is usually at least half women. So that's a situation that has really changed a lot, just even in the last 15 or so years since I was in graduate school. I didn't feel like I faced a lot of a unique challenge being female because it was already just pretty much accepted, even though most of my professors were male. I didn't feel a lack of access, but again, I was at a secular university. So there may be considerations, and I know you have probably some examples of this, considerations that professors at a seminary may have about meeting one-on-one with a female student that my secular university professors just did not have, right? It just wasn't there, not an issue for them. Maybe sometimes it should have been an issue for them, but it wasn't an issue for them. So that might be a challenge you would face, I think, in a seminary setting more so than in a secular setting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. My experience, my education was mostly in the 90s, a little bit in the 80s. But my experience at NC State, I had a good number of female professors in the English department. I'd have to go back and count, maybe more women professors than men professors. I ended up, my first academic job was as a research assistant to a professor. She was a woman. And I really think that did encourage me to think, I could do this. She's doing it. I see someone, she wasn't just like me. She was from England. She had a strong British accent. She had very blonde hair. I mean, we weren't alike, but she was a woman. And that encouraged me, like, okay, this is something that we can do. My people can do this. When I continued in graduate school at NC State, I was a research assistant and a teaching assistant for Walt Wolfram, who's still there. He's a great professor, very encouraging to all students, men and women alike, hiring students on his grants, and that was a great experience. I never felt like I was treated in any way differently from the male students. And then when I went to Texas, I worked for Richard Meyer. Most of the professors in the linguistics department at Texas at that time were men. I think there were only 2 women when I started, and then a third one was hired while I was there. So most of my professors there were men, but again, very encouraging. I was a research assistant and a teaching assistant there as well, and felt very supported and encouraged, and got good direction and good advice. So that was good. One kind of side note, and this is probably does date me, but there was a time in academia where it seemed like to be a woman in academia and to be respected, you couldn't wear makeup, you couldn't dress nicely, you had to look a certain part. And I don't feel like that's the case anymore. I don't feel like you have to look any part at this point, which is nice. You can just be yourself.
Okay, well, Dr. Quinn, you touched on one of my other questions, so I'm going to ask it. I'm going to read this question so I don't forget it, because it's a lengthy one. Some faculty here have chosen to set up relational boundaries with students of the opposite gender. These decisions are made for noble purposes, and I really want to stress that they're noble purposes. But an unintended consequence is that students have different levels of access to faculty. And because a significant majority of our faculty are male, this often becomes a hardship for women students who seek to discuss class matters outside of the classroom. What advice would you give a woman student who desires greater access to professors than they have been offered? Also, what are some ways that they could find either other professors or other outlets so that they could flourish in their education?
Well, I think one thing, and it's what we're doing right now, let's talk about this. So my advice to a student who is in a class and her male professor says, and I've heard students say this, but they're talking about the past when they will report it to me, that, you know, I took a class, they don't ever tell me which professor it is, and that's fine, but I took a class and the professor required students to meet with him to discuss the research paper that's due, the term paper, at the end of the semester, but he said he will not meet with the women students. I would say, if he's not going to meet with you, send him an email. Ask how you can meet. If you continue to get stonewalled, I would certainly go to the dean above him and say, this is a requirement. This is an opportunity that the students are being given, but I'm being singled out because I'm a woman and not given this opportunity. I think this is a conversation that needs to happen, and needs to happen often and loudly.
Yeah, I would just say that I can't imagine that really as a graduate student, but okay. Yeah, that's unacceptable. It's just unacceptable that if you need to speak, a professor would need to speak with the higher ups at the institution to see, is this even an acceptable stance to take? I think from what I know of them now, they would say no. But they may help you find creative ways to do that in a way that you both feel comfortable, because I do think our professors are in ministry. Their reputations are important. Many of them are pastors. We're talking about professors at a seminary, right? Mm-hmm. They're training people to be pastors. Their reputations are important as well. So I don't dismiss that concern. I'm also married to a professor. I don't dismiss that concern, but you would need to find a way that you could fulfill the requirements of a professor to a student, or you would need to say that I can't have students, I guess, or I couldn't have research students, certainly.
Exactly. Yeah, I think accessibility depends on how you look at it. You're supposed to have, we are supposed to have office hours. So if you want to come and talk about something that's going on, you can come during office hours. And if those office hours are not convenient, by all means, you can make an appointment. So if you want access, you should be able to get it. Can't speak to a situation where someone deliberately denies you that access. I'm kind of like Professor Aucoin. I just can't imagine that. But if it is that way, I think that is something that we do absolutely have to talk about. I'll put it to you like this. I can only speak from my perspective, but if you're going to be my student, you jolly well better anticipate access, because if you don't come to me, I will find you. You will work hard, and you will earn your degree, or you will not be my student. That's just all there is to it. In my philosophy of doing graduate work, there's a relationship that you develop. You don't take on every person that wants to be a student, because there's a lot that's involved in it. A professor that does it right invests a lot in a student, and they expect you in turn to work very hard. So yeah, it's unconscionable to think that you're going to make those kind of demands and then never give anybody any feedback. You're wasting your time with somebody who does not give you feedback, some sort of criticism, constructive or otherwise along the way. Somebody that does not meet you somewhere in between, they're doing you a great disservice, and I'd find another advisor if I was you.
You know, one area that I would mention, though, that's so certainly on an official level, like meeting with a professor during office hours, that's something that obviously they need to have an open door policy on that. The issue, though, of more informal mentoring, I can see that being a possible barrier for women, and maybe that it would be that, you know, our institution is sensitive to that, and there are female professors here that maybe as a female PhD or graduate student, you would need to find a female professor that could work with you a little bit more closely in mentoring. I don't know, it's difficult to speak to that. I mean, I remember in graduate school, sometimes the professors and some students going out, and this was a secular university, to bars after class or on Friday, and I never did that because I was a Christian, really, not so much because I was just female, but I don't know that I would have felt comfortable in that scenario. That just puts you in a whole different sort of non-professional scenario that I didn't want to be in with those individuals. So there is something to be said for it's not going to be exactly the same as a male student. It's just not. You're not male, and you can, you know, that's fine. There are many advantages to that, right? But in working with male professors, you might want to consistently seek out a female mentor that can talk to you about getting through a program, getting through a dissertation, teaching at college level or something like that.
Okay. All right, I want to give time for some questions, so if you guys are listening, we're going to have maybe in about 10 minutes some questions, but there is one time for you guys to ask questions. But one question that I do want to ask Dr. Harper is, as males at this institution, we have a few out here, how can we encourage women well in their academic institutions or academic pursuits?
Well, as I normally tell anybody that will listen, if you shut yourself off from the female population here on campus, you're really limiting yourself from working with some of our very best and brightest students. And I've always wanted to keep that particular door open because, you know, I've been blessed with some fantastic students along the way. We were talking about a couple of them who have graduated and gone on. I don't know if any of you knew Jennifer Booth or not, but Jen was one of the brightest people that I've ever known, secular or non-secular. And she's now the registrar at Columbia International, an incredibly bright woman. Christy Burgess was just wonderful. Both of them graded for me. I like to work with female graders. Just edgy and countercultural, I guess. But I like that opportunity because somebody needs to give women an opportunity like that, and that doesn't bother me at all. I'm going to pick on Heather because she's here. Heather is one of my students now. Tremendously bright young lady. It's a joy to work with her, and I find it a pleasant alternative to working with men. I sometimes wonder if men are afraid to work with me. That may be true. I don't know. I don't really care. It's just the way that it is. Don't plan on changing a whole lot for that. I mean, at one level, the work is the work, and you either do it or you don't. So I have a very pragmatic attitude about that. But in terms of giving women opportunities, I think faculty can initiate conversations. I think they can ask good questions of female students. If you've got an opening for a grader and a woman is inclined and she's capable of grading for you, I think that's a marvelous opportunity. It could give the opportunity to say, hey, I can do this. My peeps can do this, you know? Or you may go look at it and go, are you kidding me? This is what you have to do for a living? And you run screaming into the night. It's happened, so, you know, you just never know. But I think that in terms of, I jotted something down. I started not to say it, but who cares? I saw that question and I thought, yeah, that's coming. And the one thing I would say is that you can encourage women if you'll treat them like colleagues instead of conquests. I know you make of that whatever you want to, but if you'll look at gender as a less of an issue and you're looking at people in terms of people's sake and you're looking at intellect for intellect's sake, that goes a long way to tearing down a lot of barriers that I think that are erected that really shouldn't be.
All right. Thank you. Would you guys like to comment?
Well, I would just, something that I had been thinking about as we've read these questions and thought about them, and just to kind of piggyback on what you're saying, I encourage all people, faculty, students, men, women, it doesn't matter, to look at each other like individuals, like unique individuals, humans. Yeah. Don't look at me and say she's a woman. Don't look at me and say she's a white woman. Just look at me as a person. I'm a person. I'm a neighbor, and you're commanded to love your neighbor. Yep. Don't be afraid of me because I'm a woman. I'm a person. Just treat me like a person.
Okay, so one question I usually save always for last, even in most of our discussions, but what advice would you give a young woman who's considering PhD work now? Like, what's the one thing you would want to tell yourself when you started your work, or what the biggest piece of advice that you would give someone in the current climate that you see in academia?
Choose your topic wisely. You got to figure, genderless, it really doesn't matter. You're going into a program and you're going to spend the next 8 to 10, maybe 12 years of your life wrapped around this topic. Now, this is kind of on a secular track, but most people who go into a PhD program in a state school or in a Ivy League school or whatever are looking to step into academia. Your dissertation is probably going to spin off your first article. Your first publications are going to come from that research. Very likely your first book is going to be rooted and grounded in your dissertation. If you spend 5 years in your PhD program, you may rightfully expect 5 to 7 years beyond that before that dissertation ever sees the light of day in publication. That's 12 years start to finish. You better be real happy with that topic, and it better be something that you're really interested in. Otherwise, you're going to lose momentum right in the middle of it, and sometimes your interest in what you're doing is the thing that keeps you going. That would be my advice. Choose your topic well.
That's good. Yeah, that is very good advice. One thing that I'm trying to think of specific advice for women, because everything that's first of all coming to mind I think could go to men or women. Probably specifically for women perhaps, or maybe anyone who's considering going into the ministry, is I would advise you, if at all possible, that you not go into debt. And maybe that's not a possibility these days for a PhD. I don't know. I was able to graduate debt-free. My husband did have some debt that we paid off, and praise the Lord, we're done with that. So we were able to pay it off relatively early on as academic debt goes. I would just consider that you really paint yourself into a corner as a woman if you have racked up debt when you get a degree. What family choices are you going to be able to make? Are they going to be driven by this debt that you owe? Because it's not, I think you have a 6 months grace period, and after that, that's it. You have to start making those payments. So you don't want to, I would just really consider very carefully if I wanted to go into debt, even if it meant changing the program, stopping for a while, working for a while, maybe even choosing something else. That would be one piece of advice I would give.
Awesome word. Oh, yeah.
I would say I agree with both of them. As you are, choosing your topic, and as we're speaking to Christians, this is not something anyone in secular universities ever told me. I was never advised to pray about my topic. It never even occurred to me. But we can do that. We can pray about this topic, and the earlier you understand or get an idea of what your topic may be, the more you can use various classes, write your papers for those classes with a slant towards that topic. Those papers could end up being chapters in your dissertation if you know that topic early enough, and you can always slant it that way. In addition to that, what Amanda was saying earlier about understanding the time constraints of a given program. So as women, we do have considerations that are different from men. So if you are a woman, if you are married, if you're thinking about getting married, if you're thinking about having children, how will that fit in with this program? And you have to consider things like, how old am I? How long do I think this is going to take? How long do most students in this program take? And there are programs across the country that you finish your PhD in 5 or 6 years. There are programs where you finish in 10 to 12 years. That makes a difference. How much time can I take off? And even if you think you're Superwoman, if you haven't let go of that yet, you never know what's in store for you. And when I was pregnant with Zach, I was sick 24 hours a day for 8 months in trying to write my dissertation. That was not fun. I couldn't will myself out of that. So you just never know how it's going to turn out. So just being informed about those sorts of possibilities, I think, is important for women especially.
You look like you have something to say? No? Okay.
Sure.
All right. Well, this is a landmark day for library talks. We've been doing this for a year, and we actually have created time for questions from the audience. I've intended to do that at every library talk that I've led, and I have not accomplished that yet. So if you guys have any questions, now's the time to ask. And do I need to take the mic to them, or are we going to, how do you want to? Okay, repeat the question, that'll work. Rob, way back there in the back.
What is your view on women teaching in seminaries, specifically in Bible and theology?
A real softball question.
So who wants to handle that one?
So what were you going to repeat it? Did you?
Yeah, so the question was, what are our views on women teaching Bible and theology in seminaries?
Oh my, look at the time. I think we all have a 12:30 class that we really need to get to early. I'll just go ahead and say it. We're not a church. And I am open to having that discussion. And the thing that troubles me about where we are as evangelicals right now is we've gotten really good at telling women what they cannot do, but we seem closed to a discussion on what women can do. And I think that your question is a good question, and I think it's a timely question. I'm open to that. As far as that goes, we don't baptize people, we don't ordain people, we don't observe the ordinances. We are not a covenanted fellowship to go to to covenant together to worship in anything else that a church does. And I think that whenever you create an organization, frankly, a seminary, there's no biblical mandate to build seminaries. And whenever you do that, is that something you can do? Sure, of course you can. However, I don't think it's proper to take what the church is stipulated to do or regulations that are specifically applied to a church context and then say, okay, we're going to transport that and we're going to put it over here on this other institution. I'm open to it myself.
Amen.
That's not, it's coming out of a secular background. I have a PhD in history. I never considered ministry in that regard. So it really was not an issue I'd given any thought to at all until we came here, and I haven't given it as much thought, I guess, if I was teaching those classes. I tend to be accepting of the seminary position that there are questions about women teaching theology. So I'm not sure I'd be in agreement with the panel necessarily on that. If you're talking about training men who are going to be pastors, that there are some issues there. I don't think it's just cut and dried as that we're not a church. I do think there's some issues to keep in mind. I have taught a class in the seminary, Women in Church History, and it is a history class, but as in any history, you get into every aspect of life because you're talking about human history, right? We do get into theological questions, and so sometimes I would say even in that class, it's interesting, when we started that here, we've been here now 12 years, the first 2 or 3 times I taught that class, men were not allowed to take it. They just weren't allowed to enroll. And the last 2 or 3 times I've taught that class, men have enrolled. And I think it's interesting, I never got a memo saying that men were going to or not going to enroll. They just showed up in class one day. So I don't know what exactly went on there. But sometimes we do get into those issues. It's not always comfortable. Maybe it's not as comfortable for me because I don't have a seminary background. So teaching hermeneutics is not something I feel that comfortable doing anyway. But it is an issue that's going to come up, especially in those classes. I haven't had an issue since we've been here with the seminary. What is the seminary policy? Women do not teach theology classes, correct? What is the policy?
Actually, have we stated that?
Asked the question? Do you know?
I don't know.
Do we state
I don't
that
know
anywhere?
for sure.
Yeah, I had an experience.
That women do not teach theology classes, correct?
They don't teach theology and biblical studies, correct?
And biblical studies, okay.
Especially in the graduate.
Yeah.
To graduate, okay.
I had an experience. It's been a few years ago. There was a Bible translation program here. It's actually how I got my foot in the door. Not that I'm a Bible translator, but my degree's in linguistics. And so they needed someone to teach phonetics, phonology, semantics, pragmatics. And so I was teaching those classes. And in the semantics and pragmatics, that was one class together. In teaching that, how could we not talk about the Bible? There was really no way not to do it. These guys, there were only 4 students in that class. They were all men, but that was their desire. They wanted to be Bible translators. And I was very honest. I'm like, I am not a scholar of the Bible. That is, my degree's in linguistics, and we can talk about these things, and we can talk about, what does a word really mean, and how do we know what that word really means? But does dog in English mean the same thing that the Hebrew word in the Old Testament for dog meant? And we could talk about how it didn't. Often I would turn theological questions back on the students, and I would just say, look, I don't know. Ask your theology professors. But this is a good question. This is worth struggling with. So I think it is, like Amanda was saying, it is almost impossible to teach here and in any class, whether it's British Lit or whatever, and not have some theological discussion. But do I personally want to teach a Bible class? No, because I'm not qualified.
I'll say this about both of my colleagues, but especially Amanda Aucoin. It would be a sad day if men were prohibited from studying with this woman, because she's a fabulous teacher, incredibly bright, and I'm glad they're taking your class. I have directed them your way.
Maybe I have you to thank.
You may have, and then some of them have looked at me and they say, I'm afraid of that woman.
Were they related to me or no? It wasn't my husband.
No. Your reputation for red ink precedes you. Listen, and that's something, if you're looking at a program, don't fear red ink. Red ink is your friend. If a professor writes on a paper that says you can say this better, believe it. You can say it better. Take it for what it is. It's good, it's helpful, and don't shy away from people just because they're tough.
And as your question would relate to a female student, though, considering PhD studies, I just think that you just need to find out the answer to that question. If you agree with the position of the seminary you're considering or the institution about the role of women in teaching biblical studies or theology. If you don't agree, I would urge you to consider a different institution rather than, coming to sort of fight that battle. I just don't know that it would really benefit you. You might not get through the program. I would just consider that you want to be in agreement with your institution on that.
Okay. Well, I'll just add to that. Was there a question? Okay. I'll just add one thing to that I have personally benefited from the writing of 2 women. One woman's book, her fantastic book on, you will never read it, the representation of speech in Hebrew narrative. Okay, it has 150 pages on Lamor, so which means to say. So that'll be boring to everyone, but it's a fantastically written book. Her name's Cynthia Miller. She's one of my favorite Old Testament authors. And then you also have Adele Berlin, who writes on poetics in Hebrew and narrative. And so those 2 women are actually people that I go to and respect. You've got, I forget her first name, but Japheth, who writes on Chronicles and things like that. So as a student of Old Testament, I definitely read the books of women. I find their insight helpful. And so if I were to stand with Dr. Harper on that personally, it would be that if I read from them, I would definitely sit under their teaching as well. So now your question.
What is the representation of female among PhD students here at Southeastern? I know it seems to be growing more equal in like the Doctor of Education program, but certainly for the research PhD, is that more encouraged, or what is the actual representation here at Southeastern?
Do you know?
I don't know yet.
All right.
I have no hard and fast data on that, so I can't speak to it. I think I think you're right. I think it is growing, but I could not give you specifics. My impression is that you're right. It is growing.
Okay. So just for our recording purposes, the question was basically what are the percentages of female students in our PhD programs? There seems to be an increase in EDD, and just from as an observer, I would agree with that. But what about the research PhDs? And so that was the question.
One thing that I think women have to consider too, and this is going to affect our numbers, is what are the job prospects for a PhD from a seminary? You know, what are from a conservative evangelical seminary that generally doesn't accept the idea of women in the pastorate and the lead pastorship position, which is the primary paid position in Southern Baptist churches, I'm pretty sure, right? The only one in many of them. That's going to affect the number of women who seek out degrees, I think, as much as anything possibly. So maybe helping women see other avenues for their degrees, if they want to pursue, would be something we can focus on as well.
Yes.
Okay, so is that why both of you chose secular universities to receive a PhD? Just for that, or what was your choice behind that instead of a seminary?
Yeah, it never occurred to me to look at a seminary, honestly. It never occurred. I thought that only pastors went to seminary. I just didn't know. I had no idea seminaries offered anything but a degree in preaching. And I was interested in linguistics. I didn't know seminaries even knew that word. So I didn't even think about it. I was ignorant and uneducated.
I didn't consider it either. I did Soviet American cultural relations under Khrushchev was my dissertation topic. So that was not a seminary didn't come to mind. I was considering just a straight history degree. And I'm glad now because I feel like I have more options in a way for me. But it may not be true. You know, it's just wanting to have done something different than many people who are going to seminary might want to do.
Make it 3 in a row. I thought briefly about going to seminary and then rejected the whole idea because, number one, I was really interested in studying the American South, and of the places that I wanted to go, I wound up going to the University of Kentucky for a number of reasons. I didn't understand the providence of God in the way that He was working, but my wife's from Lexington. We lived right around the corner from Grandma and Grandpa. What a blessing. I mean, we graduated debt-free, and that was largely because of my in-laws. Thank God for them. I told you earlier, I stumbled into a lot of very good information that had I gone to Texas, which I thought about at Austin, believe it or not, or Vanderbilt or any other place like that, I don't know. It might not have turned out as good as it did, but God was watching over me in that. So I did not even really seriously think about going to seminary. Never entered my mind, really, seriously.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So, Rebecca.
How did you all, and since you were both married when you were doing your PhDs, how did you all invite your spouses into this? You're doing a lot of specialized work, and how do you have discussions with them and include them? And my husband and I, we have just different worlds, and so he's very supportive of this, but I just want to know, I guess, how you, and you're laughing, so now I'm really self-conscious.
I remember vividly sitting in the chair one night and coming across something that some historian somewhere said that was just remarkably stupid. And I read the paragraph out loud, and my wife was washing dishes, and she stood there very patiently looking at me. She's shaking her head, too. She remembers this. And she said, and I quote, this is one of those kairos moments. She said, "I'm glad there are people like you that can read stuff like that and tell people like me how dumb people really are," and then went right back to washing the dishes. And I thought, well, there you go. But now the other side of that coin is, if you're very careful about it and if you use patience as a weapon, you can turn them into nerds too. And that's exactly what happened, and that's the way that she is now. I no longer fear the day that I bring in a book that I paid like 3 times more than I should have for it, because she put in an order to Christian book distributors that was even more than that we'll see later on. So, yeah. Me book, Sue book. I mean, whatever. So.
I want to meet in the nerd middle, I guess.
Sometimes patience, Padawan. Sometimes it just takes time, and but it worked out okay for us, And in terms of incorporating them, the graduate students that we had at the University of Kentucky, some of them were single, some of them were married, and we tended to congregate together. We hung out with each other, we barbecued with each other, we partied with each other, and our spouses, no matter who was involved, in the program, our spouses were always included in those things whenever we got together, and that was really very helpful. Very.
Yeah. My situation was similar. We did a lot of social events, the linguistics department at UT. The professors, the students, spouses, if people were married, and there were probably about, I don't know, probably not quite half, maybe a third of the students were married. But I remember thinking, my husband made my professors seem more human. He wasn't afraid of them. He wasn't trying to be on his best behavior. I mean, he was, because I told him to. But he wasn't intimidated by them at all. He would have regular, everyday conversations with him. Like, oh, you just talked to him. What did you guys talk about? He's like, football. Oh, he talks about football. So it helped like humanize some of the professors, especially the ones that really intimidated me. They became more human. But we just talked, over dinner. I think it also helped. Scott and I started dating our senior years in college. So I was just becoming interested in linguistics. So I was kind of learning about it and able to talk to him about it as I learned. So he kind of was in a position to sort of keep up a little bit. And then he talks to me about cool ditches because he's an engineer, and I'm like, oh yes, that is a lovely ditch.
Our position is a little bit different. We met in graduate school, so we're both history PhDs. So we get each other in that regard, I guess. Although our topic matter was very different. I was Soviet American cultural relations and Russian history. He's U.S. Southern history. So I haven't read his dissertation, and he hasn't read mine. And I don't know if we ever will or not. I'm sorry. We've been too busy. We had kids. Maybe when our kids move out, we'll read each other's dissertations, but probably not before.
Okay, well, I want to respect these guys' time, but thank you, Dr. Miles, Dr. Aucoin, and Dr. Harper for being here. Let's give them a round of applause.